Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Our speakers who come to these yours events sometimes come from far-flung places, and we've had speakers from Australia and the US. But this afternoon, our speaker is from Heslington West, from the sociology department. But very pleased to have her here, and we're very interested in this project and what she has to say. A few years ago, 3 years ago maybe now, I think, Sharon Macdonald, when she was first appointed here, came and gave a yours seminar. Sharon has now moved on to the Humboldt in Berlin, but still is involved with the project that Jennie is going to talk about, which is about heritage profusion, and it's a project that obviously has a foothold in the university here in York through sociology. It's a project that's coordinated by Rodney Harrison, who's based at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL in London, and it's funded by the AAHRC. So it's a very interesting and very broad project, and I think this afternoon we're going to hear about a very specific part of it, but very close to home. It's a project that's based within the university, and therefore I'm sure this isn't the last that we'll hear of it. So Jennie, very pleased to welcome you here. Looking forward to hearing you talk. Thank you.
Lovely, great. So it's just click to move through them. Great. Okay, well, thank you, John, for that lovely introduction. And you've done some of the hard work of explaining how Curating Profusion sits in this bigger research program that's being run by Rodney Harrison down at UCL. And I'll endeavour to expand on that in my time today. So as John mentioned, I'm here to tell you about this new research project, which is funded through the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. It's led by Sharon Macdonald, and she is also, as John mentioned, in the Department of Sociology here at the University of York. And I'm working on this project as a postdoctoral researcher. So the project, as you can see by the screen there, addresses this issue of curating profusion and specifically its implications for heritage. We began the project in April of this year, so it's still quite early days. It's a 4-year project, and in very broad terms, it's looking at the ways that museums and householders make selections about what and what not to keep for the future. Or in other words, in the ways in which they're assembling the future archive. Because we are only just really at the beginning of our fieldwork research, I thought that what I would do today in my presentation is to introduce this idea of profusion in museums and homes, set out some of the intellectual impetus as well as the ambitions that we have for the project, and then I'll conclude by considering some of the topics that are starting to emerge from our thinking, reading, and fieldwork to date. I should perhaps also mention at the outset that my talk today is based on a much shorter presentation that I gave last month at the University of Gothenburg for the Critical Heritage Studies cluster. And like this talk, that one's also going to be available online, should anyone wish to watch both of them. So, before I get started, and as a way of introducing this topic of curating profusion, I'd like to screen you a very short clip from a 1956 film entitled Toute la mémoire du monde, or All the Memory in the World. This is by filmmakers Alain Resnais and Chris Marker. The film is in French, it has English subtitles, and it focuses on the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. In this film, the bibliothèque is presented to be a place where memories can be externalized and kept through the mass accumulation of material things, maps, paintings, medals, manuscripts, books, and in this short 1-minute clip that I'd like to screen, magazines and newspapers in the periodicals room. So let's see if the link works. We've got sound? institutionalised collective memory. As a gigantic and model memory of the nation, to use terms that the filmmakers use elsewhere in the film, the bibliothèque, as we saw in that clip, uses procedures for sorting, classifying, cataloguing, analysing, and storing to transform prolific and potentially unwieldy collections into encyclopedic knowledge. Unlike fallible, forgetful human minds, such institutional processes are intended to preserve and conserve these objects, and thus traces of the past and memory for perpetuity. But driven by a search for completeness and not knowing what exactly might be of interest and significance for future generations, the bibliothèque is presented at risk of bursting through continued accumulation. And in another clip that I didn't screen today, the bibliothèque is shown through construction and building work is digging deeper into the ground and expanding ever higher into the sky in an effort to contain these growing and proliferating collections. Despite the squeeze, things are shown as coming into the library, into the bibliothèque, but not as leaving. Everything must be kept. That's the rule, the filmmakers tell us. So, like the modern public library shown in that film clip, contemporary 21st century museums are also confronted, we could say, by a situation of profusion. And it's a situation indeed partly inherited from earlier collecting practices. Here in the UK, figures provided on the Museums Association website conservatively estimate that there are around 2,500 museums holding at least 200 million objects, with approximately 90% of these in storage. The cost of looking after collections is also illustrated, as the association cites claims from one museum service that it costs approximately £1,000 per square metre to build additional storage space. And this, as many of you I'm sure are very familiar with, is situated in a wider context of sustained funding cuts. So again, drawing on the Museums Association, a recent survey that they undertook in 2013 to 2014 reported that more than half, or 52%, of its responding museums had experienced a reduction to their overall income. It's perhaps not surprising then, given these kinds of figures, that the issues of sustainability and stewardship are of key discussion within the museum sector. This has resulted in attempts to create more selective acquisitions policies and increased cases of review and rationalisation. So to return to our opening film clip, it seems that the rules are indeed being rewritten. In addition to curating existing profusion, museums are also faced with an overflow of stuff from which they must choose to assemble the future archive. While certainly unevenly geographically distributed, many contemporary Western societies are characterised by an abundance of material and increasingly digital things. In a recently published popular text by author and self-titled futurist, which I think is a really intriguing kind of title in itself actually, self-titled futurist James Woolman, this is described to be a situation of stuffication. And it's a metaphor which evokes, albeit in not entirely unproblematic ways, ideas of society being overwhelmed by a glut of consumer goods. And Woolman argues that one way to address this is to start accumulating experiences rather than things. Others have talked about excessive living or a post-scarcity culture, thus emphasising that the profusion of material and digital things is considered a widespread challenge for us all. Beyond museums, this issue is certainly reflected in popular culture and struggled with also by householders. The growth in the use of self-storage facilities and the services of professional organisers and declutterers, the popularity of television series that focus on domestic accumulation or evaluating one's acquired stuff. So in the UK, I think of television series like The Hoarder Next Door, Storage Wars, or Antiques Roadshow. guides to streamlining one's life through the shedding of excess stuff. And some of you, if you're Twitter users, might have come across earlier in the year a book by Japanese declutterer Marie Kondo that was sort of widely trending. And that book encourages people to ask if their stuff sparks joy, and if it doesn't, then maybe consider getting rid of some of it. The expanded market for home storage through companies like IKEA, and a concern with issues of waste, recycling, and at capacity landfills are all indicative of how increasingly pressing the issue of coping with too much stuff is, and begin to suggest just how tricky it might be to decide what and what not to hold on to. Or as this photograph of a shop sign asks, in quite playful, albeit inadvertent ways, what will become the antiques of the future? To explain this situation further, or to consider when all this material abundance and accumulative behaviour began, we can look to another kind of profusion, the extensive commentary on what has been theorised variously as consumer society, culture, or capitalism. And collectively, this literature has drawn attention to material profusion generated from the rise of post-World War II mass consumption, mass production, and mass consumption. The scholarship has produced some really interesting thinking about accumulative behaviour by theorising the longing and desiring for and appropriating and possessing of consumer goods, thus conceptualising consumer culture, as Russell Belk, who has written widely about collecting and consumerism, does, to consist not only or even necessarily of an abundance of available goods, but as also involving, as he puts it, a personal and cultural orientation towards consumption. And what I like about this kind of work, and why I think it's important and interesting to think about, is because it suggests that consumerism cannot be understood only as driven by an increase in the availability of consumer goods, but that it also involves shifting patterns in how people relate to and engage with stuff. And it also paves a way for thinking more specifically about the relation of long-term keeping to consumerism, and to better understand the specific practice of keeping. And these are points that I'd like to return to later in my presentation, and I'll flag when I do so. I want to go back. I don't know how to go back.
Use the left or right buttons on the keyboard.
Thank you. I've got it. Thanks. Okay. Got it.
Got it?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, right, sorry.
Thank you. Of course, while the amount of stuff, as I've just been talking about, circulating in late modernity has been extensively commentated on, I think it's also important to recognise understanding profusion as a distinctly contemporary and often taken to be post-World War II phenomena should perhaps be tempered. And it seems important to begin thinking through potentially quite different manifestations and meanings of profusion at specific moments and places and times. So there are, for example, some really interesting accounts of domestic Victorian interiors where notions of luxury and status were expressed through eclecticism and clutter. And this image shows that kind of Victorian domestic interior with its clutter and sort of eclectic object juxtapositions. And the kinds of museological drive for accumulation depicted in our opening film clip might indeed be traced back to very early museum prototypes like cabinets of curiosity, which again, drawing on Russell Belk, he's talked about these, as I'm sure many of you are aware, of seeking to amass the world in its walls. We should perhaps recognise, as York-based art historians Jason Edwards and Imogen Hart, in their introduction to an edited book on Victorian interiors, reminds us that these kinds of object juxtapositions may only appear cluttered to contemporary sensibilities because they're unfamiliar to us. And it's entirely possible that we lack the expertise or knowledge required to understand these complex and eclectic visual aesthetics. So they may look cluttered to us, but it could be because we don't know how to read them visually and aesthetically. More recently, there appears to have been an intensification of profusion issues in the final decades of the 20th and continuing into the 21st centuries. Swedish ethnologist Orvar Lofgren, in his work on domestic overflow, notes that the advertising of home storage facilities has expanded greatly over the past few decades, accompanied by an emphasis on what he characterises as being an obsession for organising and tidying up. And clearly the rise of digital technologies, which have been said to result in an end of forgetting, to use a term by Rosenthal, also adds additional nuance. So it's quite sort of historically complex is what I'm trying to get at here. And indeed, trying to get a handle on historicising profusion is partly what Bryony Prestige, who's here this evening, a student associated with our project, who's based in the history department here at York, is helping us to do through her doctoral thesis research, which is going to be exploring historical aspects of museum collecting and profusion. And we're very fortunate to have Bryony on board, as she brings with her not only her expertise in history, but also a background in heritage studies, having completed her MA in Cultural Heritage Management here in the Department of Archaeology. So some of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with Bryony and her work. So we're looking forward to working with her. So moving on, well, I think my account of this literature really reflects that I'm still navigating my way through it. So rather than attempting to delve any more deeply, what I wanted to do was pull out a couple of general observations that I found useful for thinking through the effects that the mass production and consumption of consumer goods has had on collecting, keeping, and valuing things for future generations, including those specific kinds of things that we might think of as becoming heritage. First, the kinds of things considered worth holding on to has greatly expanded and proliferated. Value is certainly still attributed to the historically, culturally, or aesthetically exceptional, but the mass-produced, as well as the more mundane and ordinary, are saved for posterity. So here in the UK, museum collections dedicated to everyday and often rural or working life might be good examples. And US-based anthropologist Paul Mullins has also recently argued that the prosaic dimensions of urban materiality, or things like Macdonald's, telephone pole signs, bus stops, and lawn ornaments, should be collected to communicate the meanings and distinctive character of present-day city life. And here, I think that contemporary event-based acquisition is another aspect of collecting that seems particularly relevant to this discussion at this point that I'm making. And this is illustrated, for example, by the V&A Museum's Rapid Response Collecting Program, which was initiated in 2014. And it seeks to acquire things in response, as explained on the website, and this is just a screenshot of the website, to major moments in history or technological advances, global events, political changes, and pop culture phenomena. So this includes, as you can see on the screen there, collecting the world's first 3D printed gun, a soft toy used as an object of political dissent, and also Louboutin heels and 5 shades of nude. So there's some of the objects that they've been collecting in response to these contemporary events and contemporary moments. I think that the museum's use of Twitter for inviting suggestions for what to collect through its rapid response hashtag is really interesting, because it demonstrates not only a desire for participatory modes of museum collecting, but possibly an exploration of the potentialities of social and digital media to speed up the museum's ability to respond to contemporary events and to collect from them. So a related and second point that I'd like to make in terms of these sort of general observations about the effects of consumerism and long-term keeping is that the contemporary phenomena of using the term curating beyond museums, the art world, and even objects themselves seems somehow also bound up in this consumerist trend. And it's a topic taken up in a recently published book by author, a journalist, at least, David Balzar, exploring, as you can see on the screen there, curationism, or the idea that we're all curators now, as we select, arrange, and display everything from our home furnishings to our music playlists, social media websites, gardens, and clothing. I think one way to interpret this trend might be through, again, returning to the consumption studies type literature, what some consumption studies scholars have theorized as being prosumer capitalism, or the idea that we're now in an age when distinctions between production and consumption are increasingly blurred as people co-create what they consume. More usual examples discussed are things like self-service petrol pumps, scanning your own groceries, using ATM machines rather than bank tellers. However, the application of curation to an ever-expanding amount and range of stuff and co-curating the things that we consume seems one that, to me at least, is potentially worth thinking through in more detail and in relation to such frameworks as we progress with this project. Having pulled out these two general observations that you can see on the screen there about consumerism and long-term keeping, I just want to flag also that, of course, the consumerist trend is not the only way to understand a late modern interest in amassing more and increasingly ordinary types of stuff. And it is also discussed in slightly different ways by drawing on thinking from within the field of memory studies by critical heritage studies scholars. Such scholars identify a broadening and proliferation of things classified as heritage and a widespread democratization and interest in the past, or what is often talked about and described in the UK as being the heritage boom. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term by Hewinson. Critical heritage studies scholar Rodney Harrison has talked about such trends collectively as being a heritagization of society, in which, as he writes, traces and memories of many different pasts pile up, constantly surfacing and intervening in our present, end quote. So for Harrison and a small yet emerging number of scholars concerned particularly with these issues around the sustainability of heritage, we seem almost to be at a tipping point where ongoing accumulation of heritage perhaps risks undermining the very notion of heritage itself. And in response, they, again drawing on this memory studies literature, argue that collective memory making by accumulating, retaining and valuing those things that we identify as heritage for future generations necessarily requires selecting others to forget about or otherwise responsibly let go of. In any case, if we are all supposedly acting as curators and accumulating an ever-increasing and ever-diversifying amount of stuff, then it would seem important to understand what exactly is being kept for the future and why. What is involved in caring for these things, and what strategies are crafted to ensure their longevity, to ensure that they're being pushed into the future? What else is retained along with material things? Are we also attempting to hold on to information, stories, traditions, experiences, sensations, or feelings? Does the digital help us to mediate material abundance, or does it create its own and perhaps potentially distinctive other kinds of profusion? How is curatorial practice and heritage management responding to and being shaped by the challenge of coping with profusion? And it's questions like these that are the focus then of our Curating Profusion project. As John mentioned when he introduced me, the Curating Profusion project is part of a bigger AHRC funded research program led indeed by Rodney Harrison at UCL down in London. And this research program is called Assembling Alternative Futures for Heritage, or AAFH for short. And because our project is nested within this bigger research program, I'd like to take you a few minutes just to tell you a little bit more about the wider research program in which it sits. So AAFH, as you can see on the screen here, involves academics and researchers from the universities of York, Exeter, UCL, and Linnaeus University in Sweden, and a range of partner organisations, some of whom are here tonight, including the York Museums Trust, the Association of Independent Museums, the New Schoolhouse Gallery in York, and Arts Council England, Yorkshire. And though the ones involved there, those are the partner organisations that are collaborating very specifically with the Curating Profusion project. But as you can see, for the AAFH research program, there are a number of other collaborating partner organisations as well. So the AAFH research program is exploring heritage in its most expansive sense by taking as its starting point the idea that heritage is fundamentally concerned with future making. By looking at various heritage and heritage-like sites, from museums and homes to seed banks, world heritage sites, rewilded landscapes, and nuclear waste disposal facilities, AAFH brings together sites that are not usually or not often compared, but share common heritage management practices and processes of collecting, cataloguing, curating, and conserving. In doing so, the different work packages across the universities involved are exploring how the past is drawn on to resource and shape the future in the face of various present contemporary threats. So in our project, the struggle of curating the future archive in the face of a profusion and overflow of stuff. But others are looking at conserving diversity, the uncertainties of especially long or deep heritage futures, and the management of change in heritage contexts. So the fundamental aim of AAFH is comparative. By providing examples of these future-making heritage practices from contexts that are not often or not usually thought about in heritage terms, it seeks to consider alternative directions for theorising and preserving heritage. So that's AAFH. Moving back to our specific project, Curating Profusion. As part of the program, we've chosen to focus on two contexts that, as I've already explained, face material and also increasingly digital abundance: households and museums. I'm not going to talk extensively today about our methodologies. You can feel free to ask me after the more formal part of the presentation if you like more detail. But I will take a few moments to outline in quite broad terms our fieldwork approach and how we hope to engage with the kinds of research questions that I've already introduced. To manage our own potential research proliferation, we're choosing to focus on households and museums in the UK, and especially social history museums. This is because we suspect that social history museums particularly struggle with choosing what to keep from the period of mass production and mass consumption, resulting also in challenges of duplicate items. And due to their democratic remit, their collecting is often focused on acquiring objects from everyday life and collating information about lived experiences and also the kinds of contemporary and current events that I alluded to earlier. In practice, social history museums are smaller and compared to the national institutions are relatively understudied. Although here I would note that I'm really looking forward to reading a very recently published book just within the last fortnight by Fiona Candlin, which focuses on what she calls micro-museology. And it's based on her research on small, independent and single subject museums. So I think that's going to be a great book for us to look into. To look at domestic profusion, we're focusing on households rather than individuals, so as to examine the circulation of stuff within homes, and to also unpack some of the social dynamics between householders who might, after all, have quite different motivations and practices for dealing with their stuff. Close to home, think here of my husband and I, we have very different approaches to how we deal with our stuff and what we might keep for the future. In both contexts, we're using ethnographic methodologies, being anthropologists, including in-depth interviews, surveys, participant observation, and also, where appropriate, visual and sensory techniques, employing photography and video. We're mixing short site visits to museums and households with some more intensive case studies, including repeat engagements. So since April, since we began the project in April, the first phase of the research really since then has involved consulting professionals who help both museums and householders to make these kinds of long-term keeping decisions, and also reviewing materials produced by them, such as websites, blogs, reports and guidelines. So in museums, we've done a little bit of work speaking to people working in the areas of collections review and rationalisation. And in homes, we've begun learning about the work of professional declutterers and organisers. And research with these professionals has further shaped our approach for selecting households that we're going to do further work with. And it's shown us that there are really key times, or what for the time being, we're conceptualising as being moments, when this kind of long-term keeping is foregrounded, and during which people are typically quite self-reflexive about these issues of saving for the future. Therefore, in the household part of the study, we want to be looking at some of these moments. Things such as moving where one is living, sorting through inherited stuff, creating a collection or maybe a commemoration like a family archive, and also more routine and kind of mundane activities for dealing with overflow, including tidying up or perhaps putting things into storage. Dealing with stuff during these moments is not straightforward. And indeed, it's precisely that it's not straightforward, and precisely because of this struggle that we think these moments are really richly revealing of the assumptions and constraints which guide selections, and of their consequences for what is and is not saved. Of course, when analysing these moments, we will be paying attention where it comes into play to other influencing factors like gender, class, age, and or ethnicity. But I emphasise that our main aim is to identify patterns of action, meaning and value, informing a range of possible ways that people are curating profusion, rather than attempting to correlate these two specific demographics. And this is not least because, as I've already quite extensively outlined, we see profusion as being a really widespread issue that all of us potentially face at some point in our lives. So, having introduced then the topic of profusion in homes and museums, as well as some of the aims for our project and giving you a bit of a feel for the approach that we're going to take to our fieldwork, I'd like, in the remainder of my presentations, the final 10, 15 or so minutes, to consider some of the emerging topics that have come out of our reading, thinking, discussing, and also preliminary fieldwork to date. And before talking about these, I'd like to suggest that for those of you who are studying here in the archaeology department, and particularly on the MA in Cultural Heritage and Management, I think that these might link quite well to the sorts of things that you're also probably likely to be thinking about and discussing between yourselves as well. This includes the processes and practices of heritage, examining the multiple values and meanings that are attributed to and shape heritage, as well as some of the formalised systems of heritage making like policy and legislation. So in no particular order, the topics that I'd like to tell you about today are moralising profusion, value, and temporalities. And in the spirit of looking forward, I very much offer these as points of discussion rather than being any kind of summative account of our research. So I do welcome questions about them afterwards. So the first topic then that we've been thinking about is how profusion seems so very often to take on a kind of moral impetus. In dealing with domestic profusion, abundance is often presented as a personal failing, and dealing with clutter, an opportunity for self-renewal to become a certain kind of person. So to return to Kondo's bestseller that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, tidying in that book is presented as having, and here I'm literally just using words off the back blurb of the book, as magical and life-changing capacities, because an ordered house can result in confidence, success, energy, and the motivation to create the life you want. So very crudely put, a clear house is a clear mind might be a phrase that sums up that kind of perspective. In museums, debates around disposal also evoke a moral economy through discourses of ethics, trust, and accountability, or ideas, I would suggest, about what it means to be a good, responsible, and transparent public institution. So again, curating profusion and dealing with profusion here is sort of bound up in these arguments about becoming a particular kind of public institution. We are, of course, not the only scholars to have noticed how easily abundance of stuff becomes associated with particular moral assumptions. And two key books that engage with this issue are by ethnologists Barbara Sienowska and Orvar Lofgren. And I put the titles on the screen here just in case anybody is interested in reading and following these up. So in these books, the editors draw on Michel Calon's work on framing to argue that empirical investigation is needed into how too much is defined and managed and by whom. And in doing so, they push back against some of the moral assumptions. We might even say a kind of pathologizing that they regard as all too often linked to overflow. And what I really like about these books then is that they usefully remind us, I think, that discourses around profusion are often morally charged. And so I think how this moral terrain is negotiated through and partly shapes and plays back into approaches to curating profusion might be something that we'll be interested to look at as our research progresses. So to really just illustrate further or give quite a concrete example, I guess, of what I mean by a moral economy being negotiated through and shaping approaches to curating profusion. I think here of a paper presented very recently at a really excellent conference just a few weeks ago, hosted at the Science Museum on unloved collections. And this paper was by curator Nikki Reeves, and it analysed visible storage in museums. So in his paper, and also on a website outlining the related project that he's doing about the ceramics galleries of the V&A Museum, which show the bulk of these collections in visible storage. And this is a screenshot from the project and also gives the website address. So in this paper, Reeves queried what is being made visible by visible storage. And he argued that it's not just objects that are being put on display, but collections care and management principles, as well as the behind-the-scenes labour or work of museums. Through the use of glass, ambitions, as Reeves discussed, of transparency, accountability, and accessibility are literally inscribed into the physical fabric of the museum. And it just really struck me as I was listening to this paper that was a really interesting and actually quite complex example of how the wider moral economy becomes entangled with and partly shapes approaches to curating profusion. So here we might say that the perceived value and use of densely stored collections and retained stuff is reinvigorated by making objects and the ways that institutions themselves invest in and care for these publicly visible. So this leads quite nicely then into the second topic that I'd like to just briefly mention as having emerged from some of our thinking to date, and this is value, the topic of value. Value is acutely foregrounded in these issues of curating profusion. One way that some museums are dealing with profusion is to apply in ways that echo designatory systems used in World Heritage more selective criteria for assessing the significance by better defining the meanings and values of collections or heritage items. So categories that are typically used are things like provenance, rarity, condition, or historical significance, and these help museums to rank the significance of collections. So in both museums and homes, we therefore want to understand the meanings and values that inform why certain things are considered worth keeping hold of, which after all is perhaps the ultimate expression of value, keeping it, while also recognising that the affordances, to use a phrase by anthropologist Tim Ingold, or the properties of things themselves, like their physical durability or their materiality, might also shape such decisions. So it's not all, potentially not all about those values. Moreover, when outlining the background to our project earlier, I noted that while the consumption studies literature has been really useful for thinking about accumulative behaviour, or this desire to acquire and possess stuff, I felt that there was a need to consider more closely and to think quite carefully about safekeeping as a distinct practice in itself. Thus, we're also looking at what keeping itself does to the value and meaning of things. And partly we would expect keeping to transform the mundane and the ordinary into the rather more special by removing them from circulation and often to use. Although here there are differences to explore, I think, between museums and households. This interest in value connects our project to a really very established anthropological thinking around specific categories of things and how differently classified things are variously dealt with and acquire their worth and meaning. So very briefly described, this includes classic work distinguishing commodities from gifts, challenges to these distinctions through the social lives and biographies of things scholarship, and more recent work on biographic objects, which reveals the interplay between objects, identity, and self-narration, or perhaps I should say more accurately, self-formation, which emphasises not only what we do to, but what we do with objects, and also perhaps what these objects do to us. This obviously is a really quick and very scanty account of a vast field of literature, but I did want to mention it because I think in mentioning it, it shows that our project has potential to tap into and be seen in relation to such literatures, particularly through our concern to look at how different kinds of objects are classified, related to and dealt with, and made meaningful or significant through people's actions and as located within specific social formations and relationships and contexts, thus being variously accorded value and ultimately in ways that go beyond purely economistic notions. I think that these kinds of literature are going to be particularly useful for helping us to understand notions like investment, legacy, expectations and obligation, which even in our very sort of tentative steps into fieldwork are already starting to emerge as being bound up with these safekeeping decisions. And here, Canadian anthropologist Jean Marcoux, writing about the keeping decisions that elderly Canadians make when they move into care facilities, is a really good example, I think, of how this kind of anthropological thing theory can be used to understand these kinds of ideas, these kinds of ethnographic themes, ethnographic topics. And in his case, he uses this theory to analyse how the placing of certain kinds of things with certain kinds of people ancestralizes, or is intended to push oneself through time, because objects, he argues, by drawing on these kinds of literature, come to stand in for persons. So the final topic that I'm just going to very briefly mention before concluding is the topic of temporalities. And this is another area that we've been doing a bit of thinking around. Choosing to save things for posterity could be interpreted as a countercurrent to the speedy temporalities and a fascination with newness that are often said to drive Western hyperconsumption, although that has been debated as well. This kind of statement overlooks all sorts of complexities of the kinds identified, for example, in sociologist Colin Campbell's excellent discussion about the paradoxical ways that valorising old things can actually feed into what he calls the cult of the new. Yet museums typically are institutions that refuse the accelerated acquiring and discarding of contemporary throwaway culture to focus instead on a much longer term keeping. And the desire to hold on to things for posterity might be interpreted as pushing back against consumerist trends for stuff with short and increasingly disposable lifespans. And both households and museums, retained artefacts, keepsakes, heirlooms, and mementos are perceived to somehow stretch individual and collective narratives, meanings, and values across generations, and in doing so create durable and continuous identities. So all of this is a way of saying that we are thinking about these kinds of temporal issues and how particular temporal orientations and related social formations associated specifically with late modernity might be expressed, configured, or possibly challenged through future keeping practices. Put in a different way, or stated differently, we want to know what people mean when they say they're keeping for future generations, forever, or perpetuity. What does that mean? And how these visions of imagined timescales and anticipated heirs shape what is retained and how it's managed and cared for. And here I think it's going to be really informative and interesting to be able to bring our findings into dialogue with other work packages in the AAFH research program, particularly those that are looking at sites with very deep or long futures, so sites looking at nuclear waste disposal facilities. So, we're almost there. These topics clearly are not exhaustive of all of the potential areas that our project could connect with, and certainly one of the big challenges for us is managing our own research profusion and research proliferation. But hopefully by outlining them, as well as setting out a background to and aims for our project, I've provided you with a feeling of some of the kinds of key topics and emerging themes that we hope to further explore through our fieldwork, and by bringing our findings into dialogue with those emerging from the bigger AAFH program. I focused today specifically on themes of moralising profusion, value, and temporalities. Yet within these, I began to hint at a range of other areas for empirical and conceptual investigation, including how the affordances or properties of things themselves might shape future keeping possibilities, or might demand us to push them into the future, actually. Thus foregrounding perhaps the agency of things themselves, or at least the attribution of agency to things. And also the interplay between homes and museums through possible shared museological modes of coping with profusion, including considering quite carefully, I argued, what the act of keeping does to a thing. These are topics then that form a platform or a basis on which our project is going to develop over the coming years. And it's really on those thoughts that I would like to conclude and end and open the floor to any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennie, for that absolutely fantastic and fascinating and enormous profusion of research that you presented for us today. Would anybody like to start out with a question?
You need to ask me how I'm going to cull my own research.
How have you got any sense that, I know it's early days, about how people are deciding how to keep some of these everyday objects? Is it a good example? Has it got a good story behind it? What are some of the criteria that people are using to actually say, right, this is the object, and we're not going to those other examples?
It's a good question, and one we should be able to answer in 3.5 years. Yeah, yeah, I mean, I haven't done enough research yet with the households to be able to give you any kind of any well formulated answer to that. So I think what has become really clear, particularly from doing this initial phase of the research where we've been consulting and also doing research on materials produced by the professionals who help museums and householders to make these kinds of decisions about what they keep and what not to keep, is that these moments are really key. So I mentioned these moments that we're wanting to explore more about. So things like, creating a family archive, or dealing with someone's stuff perhaps after they've died, or inheritance, and that these kinds of moments are going to be really, really rich for being able to explore those questions, because they're not simple. It's not simple, it's actually really, really complex, and by exploring that complexity, it will throw out some of these sort of assumptions and values and judgments. I mean, yeah, in the museum's work also, we're starting to get a better handle on some of the ways that they, with my discussion about the collection's significance, how they are kind of grappling with this in terms of using categories of value, so things like rarity and provenance. The literature is really helpful, so the things that I've been reading about, sense of belonging, these things, wanting to have an inheritance, push yourself through time, these are all play into why people want to hold on to things as well. So I don't have an answer yet, but I will.
Have you thought at all about how or if the different types of owners of these different museums plays into what gets kept and what doesn't, and how the decisions are made?
So the owners of museums?
Yeah, whether it's a heritage body or a trust or that kind of, those different sort of levels of ownership.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think that's probably something that we need to be really aware of, actually. Yeah, and I mean, we're focusing particularly on smaller museums, so with the sort of specificities in terms of how they are managed and operationalised, I'm sure that will emerge. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a sidestep, but something I have been quite interested in trying to sort of set the broader scene for the museum's part of the study as well, is the wider sort of networked environment in which museums might operate for helping them through these profusion issues. So, for example, networked projects for reviewing and rationalising collections across multiple museums. So I think trying to get a better handle also on the networked environment in which museums operate as well might be quite useful. So it's a different aspect to what you asked specifically about, but it's a great question. Thank you. We'll need to think about that.
Gareth?
All right, I'm thinking you're going to be talking to people who have domestic collections as well as institutions. Is that right?
Collecting, yeah. So I mentioned that one of the moments we might be looking at is if people at home are having their own collection. Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering then if you're thinking of going in that direction, what kinds of households are you going to be looking at? Even if thoughts about it yet, or is it?
In terms of the collecting households?
Yes, yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. So if you're looking at households who collect, how would you choose those? I suppose is the question. If you haven't answered yet, it's okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, would house? I don't know. It's a truthful answer.
Yeah.
We are interested in households who might be assembling a collection, but are you talking about whether or not they're assembling a particular kind of collection? I'm trying to understand how householders themselves might categorize.
I don't know. It's how you choose to approach the problem, I suppose. I was just you said about domestic collections, and I was just interested in which domestic collections it is that you're particularly interested in.
I don't think we're interested in a particular kind of domestic collection. We're interested in a broader idea of people at home potentially assembling a collection, or maybe assembling a more sort of commemorative type collection, such as a family album, family archive, through perhaps photos, scrapbooking. I know, people sometimes make like memory sort of capsules for their children, things like that. So those kinds of collections, I think, would be really interested in, particularly because they're seen as pushing specific kinds of things to future generations. So those would be the kinds of collecting activity that we would be particularly interested in, where there's a reflection on trying to push things for future generations. Yeah. It's good. That's really helpful. It's got me thinking more about that.
Following on from that a little bit, because I'm thinking about class basically for me, and thinking about how antiquarian collections were very much an upper class diversion, upper and upper middle class. And I was also thinking about the temporalities, seeing the moment of when you're thinking about the future, when the antiquarian would label the collection versus feeling like that person, we could say pretty confidently, would be able to bring the collector around to the entire museum and explain things to the point where the collection needs an explanation, a label. It becomes a museum. So seeing when people's personal collections in regard to that need some kind of outside explanation. You can keep a box of keepsakes, but if you're not around to explain it, then it's not self-evident.
Absolutely.
So that might be an interesting schism for you to explore.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I didn't talk about today, but we're very keen to, which I think relates to the excellent point you're making, to unpack a little bit is, do households think of themselves as using museological modes of curating, displaying, cataloguing, interpreting? So looking at those points of crossover, and actually, again, something that I didn't have time to mention today is we're trying to also very explicitly, as another kind of moment, find examples through our fieldwork of households, when households and museums come into explicit contact around these future keeping collections. So for example, when curators are involved in household clearances, because I think, again, that would be really interesting to explore the strategies and approaches of householders and museums coming up against each other, so to speak. So yeah, it's a really good question, really good point. Thank you.
I butted in, but I think I have another question.
Well, I was kind of what you were going to ask about how you were going to construct your kind of sample of households, and also whether it was a new phenomenon or whether, in fact, I mean, you've already alluded to the fact that people have always collected and have always amassed things. What's so different about what you're looking at now to what has always gone on, or is there any difference?
Well, I mean, I think I addressed that in the paper a bit when I talked about trying to historically locate profusion and mentioned that we've got a wonderful PhD student in the history department who will be helping us with that, and indeed looking at these earlier moments of profusion and are they the same, are they different? So I absolutely agree with you. I think that's really important not to assume that this is all a post-World War II contemporary phenomenon, but then also try and think about, well, what is new about profusion now? So, yeah, I agree with you.
Great topic.
Thanks. Yeah. No, Sharon and I are really excited about it.
Gina.
Hiya.
Hey. Thanks.
I was wondering, at sort of early stages when you looked into, obviously this is quite a Western-heavy project at the moment, when you looked into Eastern philosophies, we're really interested to hear.
That's a lovely question as well. We are very much focused on the UK. We do have international partners on the project. So there may, both on Curating Profusion, but also more broadly on AAFH. So there may well be scope for us to bring in comparative elements there. And obviously anthropology, a really sort of key tenet of the way that anthropology practices through comparison. And again, a lot of the secondary literature as well. I mean, I think the Eastern philosophy is really interesting. I guess my initial gut reaction to that is I think it would be really interesting to see the way that maybe some of those kinds of philosophies are becoming sort of bound up in the wider discourses around dealing with profusion. So, for example, the kinds of self-help sort of manuals that I mentioned in terms of clearing clutter. I think that would be quite an interesting way to explore that as well. But we are focused on the UK, but we'll try where relevant.
I noticed you had a couple of Chinese partners in the wider project.
Yeah, we do.
Do you know anything about that?
So those are specifically partners that Sharon has worked with before. So again, they may be avenues where we can bring in some of this international element. Yeah.
One last question.
That was really, really interesting, thank you. And I think it's more of just a comment really rather than a question. But
Great.
I think it strikes me as really interesting how I think profusion sort of suggests how archives are very much biased at kind of selections of things. It just reminds me of kind of when you get grave goods that are very selective, and it's like it's obviously not representative of everyday life. It's these moments, like you're saying, that are snapshots of abnormal events that are being preserved for the future. And I think it's quite interesting how you could almost think that archives are not actually representative of real life at all in a way. I don't know what you think.
I think it's a lovely comment, and I think it's a really important comment because you raise a really key and crux issue, which is about representation and how do we represent everyday life through these objects. So, I mean, yeah, just thinking on a personal level, if I wanted to represent my life, what would I hold for the future? Would I keep my cell phone? If I was going to keep my cell phone, which one? Yeah, would I? Yeah, so it's a really central issue. So it's a great comment. Thank you.
Well, I think we're going to go, if you mind joining us for a drink at the
Great.
Three-Legged Mare.
Yeah, sounds
believe
great.
Our usual spot.
Closed. I think they're refitting it.
I don't know what to do. Suggestions. The Guy Fawkes is quite expensive, isn't it?
Can be, it's